The Lives of the Saints by the Reverend Alban Butler, taken from the 4th edition, published in 1954. December 15th, Saint Eusebius, Bishop of Vercelli. Saint Eusebius was born of a noble family in the Isle of Sardinia, where his father is said to have died in chains for the faith. His mother, whose name was Restituta, being left a widow, carried him and a daughter she had both in their infancy to Rome. Eusebius was brought up in the practice of piety and in the study of sacred learning, and ordained lictor by St. Sylvester. We know not by what accident he was called to Vercelli, a city now in Piedmont. He served that church among the clergy with such applause that the episcopal chair becoming vacant, he was unanimously chosen by the clergy and people to fill it. He is the first bishop of Vercelli whose name we know. St. Ambrose assures us that he was the first who in the West united the monastic life with the clerical, living himself and making his clergy in the city live, almost in the same manner as the monks in the East did in the deserts. They shut themselves up in one house with their pastor, and exercised themselves night and day in a heavenly warfare, continually occupied in the praises of God, and having no other ambition than to appease his anger by fervent and uninterrupted prayers. Their minds were always employed in reading or at work. The holy bishop saw that the best and first means to labor effectually for the edification and sanctification of his people was to form a clergy under his eyes, on whose innocence, piety, and zeal in the functions of their ministry he could depend. In this design he succeeded so well that other churches earnestly demanded his disciples for their bishops, and a great number of holy prelates came out of his school who were burning and shining lamps in the church of God. He was at that same time very careful to instruct his flock and inspire them with the maxims of the gospel. Many, moved by his exhortations, embraced virginity to serve God in purity of heart without being divided by the cares or pleasures of the world. In a short time the whole city of Vercelli appeared inflamed with the fire of divine love which Jesus Christ came to bring on earth, in which he ardently desired to see kindled in all hearts. Convicted by the force of the truth which the zealous pastor preached, persuaded by the sweetness and charity of his conduct, and still more powerfully excited by his examples, sinners encouraged themselves to a change of their lives, and all were animated to advance more and more in virtue. But his sanctity would have been imperfect without the trial of persecutions. The Arians governed all things by violence under the authority of the Arian Emperor Constantius. In 354, Pope Liberius deputed St. Eusebius with Lucifer of Cagliari to beg leave of that emperor, who passed that winter at Arles in Gaul, to assemble a free council. Constantius agreed to a council, which met at Milan in 355, whilst the emperor resided in that city. Eusebius, seeing all things would be there carried on by violence through the power of the Arians, though the Catholic prelates were more numerous, refused to go to it till he was pressed by Liberius himself, and by his legates, Lucifer of Cagliari, Pancratius, and Hilary, in order to resist the Arians, as St. Peter had done Simon the magician. When he was come to Milan, the Arians excluded him the council for the 10 first days. When he was admitted, he laid the Nicene Creed on the table, and insisted on all signing that rule of faith before the cause of St. Athanasius should be brought to a hearing, for the chief drift of the heretics was to procure, if possible, the condemnation of that most formidable champion of the faith. Many were gained by the artifices of the Arians, or intimidated by the threats of the emperor, and signed the sentence which was pronounced against him. The emperor sent for St. Eusebius, St. Dionysius, and Lucifer of Cagliari, and pressed them to condemn Athanasius. They insisted upon his innocence, and that he could not be condemned without being heard. "I am his accuser," said Constantius. "Believe upon my word the charge brought against him." The bishops answered, "This is not a secular affair that requires your opinion as emperor." Constantius took them up in anger, saying, "My will ought to pass for a rule. The bishops of Syria are satisfied that it should be so. Obey, or you shall be banished." The bishops represented to him that he must one day give an account to God of his administration. The prince, in the transport of his rage, thought once of putting them to death, but was content to banish them. The officers entered the sanctuary, tore the holy prelates from the altar, and conducted them to different places. Dionysius was sent to Cappadocia, where he died. He is commemorated in the Roman Martyrology on the 25th of May. Lucifer was banished to Germantia in Syria, of which city Eudoxus, a celebrated Arian, was bishop, and our saint to Scythopolis in Palestine, there to be treated at the discretion of the Arian bishop Petrophilus. Their chains did not hinder them from serving the church, and they confounded the heretics wherever they went. Pope Liberius wrote to them a letter of congratulation, exhorting them to courage and constancy. St. Eusebius was lodged at first with the good Count Joseph, and was comforted by the visits of St. Epiphanius and other holy men, and by the arrival of the deputies of his church of Vercelli, with presents for his subsistence. A great share of the presents he gave to his fellow confessors and to the poor. But his patience was to be exercised by greater trials. Count Joseph died, and the Arians, with the emperor's officers, insulted the saint, dragged him on the ground through the streets, sometimes carried him backwards, half naked, and at last shut him up in a little chamber, plying him for days with all manner of violences to engage him to conform. They forbade his deacons and other fellow confessors to be admitted to see him. The saint had abandoned his body to suffer all manner of evil treatments from their hands, without opening his mouth all that while. But seeing himself debarred of his only comfort and support, he sent a letter to the Arian bishop Petrophilus with the following direction: Eusebius, the servant of God, with the other servants of God who suffer with me for the faith, to Petrophilus the jailer, and to his officers. After a short relation of what he had suffered, he desired that his deacons might be allowed to come to him. After he remained in that confinement 4 days without eating, the Arians sent him back to his lodgings. 25 days afterwards they came again, armed with clubs, broke down a wall in the house, and dragged him again into a little dungeon with a priest named Tigrinus. They rifled his lodgings, plundered all his provisions, and cast many priests, monks, and even nuns into public prisons. His sufferings here were aggravated every day, till the place of his exile was changed. From Scythopolis he was sent into Cappadocia, and sometime afterwards into Upper Tobias in Egypt. We have a letter which he wrote from the third place of his banishment to Gregory, bishop of Elvira, to encourage him vigorously to oppose Osius, who had unhappily fallen, and all who had forsaken the faith of the Church without fearing the power of kings. He expresses a desire to end his life in sufferings, that he might be glorified in the kingdom of God. The short letter discovers the zeal of a holy pastor, joined with the courage of a martyr. Constantius being dead, toward the end of the year 361, Julian gave leave to all the banished prelates to return to their sees. St. Eusebius left Tobias and came to Alexandria to concert measures with St. Athanasius for applying proper remedies to the evils of the Church. He was present and subscribed immediately after St. Athanasius in the council held there in 362, by which it was resolved to allow the penitent prelates who had been deceived by the Arians, especially at Rimini, to preserve their dignity. From Alexandria our saint went to Antioch to endeavor to extinguish the great schism there, but found it widened by Lucifer of Cagliari, who had ordained Paulinus bishop. He would not communicate with Paulinus, but made haste out of Antioch. Lucifer resented this behavior and broke off communion with him, and with all who at that late council of Alexandria received the Arian bishops in their dignity upon their return to the true faith. This was the origin of the schism of Lucifer, who by pride lost the fruit of his former zeal and sufferings. St. Eusebius traveled over the east and through Illyricum, confirming in the faith those that were wavering, and bringing back many that were gone astray. Italy, at his return, changed its mourning garments according to the expression of St. Jerome. There St. Hilary of Poitiers and St. Eusebius met, and were employed in opposing the Arians, particularly Auxentius of Milan. But that crafty heretic had gained the favor of Valentinian, and maintained himself under his protection against the united zealous efforts of St. Hilary and St. Eusebius. St. Jerome in his chronicle places the death of the latter in 371. An ancient author says it happened on the 1st of August. He is styled a martyr, and 2 old panegyrics in his praise, printed in the appendix of the works of St. Ambrose. There only remain of his works the 3 epistles above quoted. In the Cathedral of Vercelli is shown an old MS copy of the Gospels of St. Matthew and St. Mark, said to be written by St. Eusebius. It was almost worn out with age near 800 years ago, when King Berengarius caused it to be covered with plates of silver. The body of St. Eusebius is laid in a shrine above a side altar in the Cathedral at Vercelli. The Roman Missal and Breviary give his office on the 15th of December, which is probably the day on which his relics were removed, for his name occurs in ancient calendars on the 1st of August. The Holy Fathers, who by their zeal and learning maintained the true faith, shunned the dangerous rocks of error, because in their studies they followed the rules laid down by divine revelation, and made sincere humility the foundation of all their literary pursuits. Conscious that they were liable to mistakes, they entertained a modest confidence in themselves and their own judgment, and said with St. Austin, "I may err, but a heretic I will never be." This humility and caution is a sure guard against any fatal errors in religion or dangerous miscarriages in civil conduct. With regard to literary attempts, into which an overbearing pride chiefly betrays men, many in studying pursue their speculations so far as to lose sight of common sense, and by too intense an application to things beyond their sphere, overset and unhinge their understanding. Many mistake the wildest fancies of their brain for reason. How many heresies have been set up by scholars among Christians? The root of these abuses is a secret vanity, self-sufficiency, or complacency in opinion of their own knowledge or penetration, which scholars easily entertain. So true it is, as the Apostle tells us, that science puffs up, not of itself, but through the propensity of the human heart to pride. It is therefore necessary that every student learn, in the first place, never to trust in his own abilities, and to take modesty and humility, by which men know themselves, the foundation of his learning.